When people think of famous royal graves being opened, they often imagine archaeologists searching for lost kings or scientists carrying out DNA tests. The graves of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were opened for a very different reason. The exhumation in 1815 was not carried out for scientific research or because there was any mystery about how they had died. Instead, it was part of an attempt to restore the honour of France's last king and queen before the French Revolution. Their bodies had originally been buried in secret, without royal ceremonies or monuments, and more than 20 years later, after the fall of Napoleon, the restored French monarchy decided that King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette deserved proper royal burials. To achieve this, their graves had to be located, opened, and their remains carefully recovered. The story of their exhumation is one of revolution, political change, loyalty and remembrance. It also explains how two of history's most famous monarchs finally came to rest among generations of French kings. King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine on the 21st of January 1793 during the French Revolution. His trial had declared him guilty of treason against the French nation after the monarchy was abolished. Although many Europeans still regarded him as the rightful King of France, the revolutionary government wanted to remove every symbol of the old monarchy. Immediately after his execution, in what is now the Place de la Concorde in Paris, Louis's body was transported by cart to the Madeleine cemetery. There was no royal procession, no mourning court and no grand funeral service. The revolutionaries wanted his burial to be ordinary as possible. His body was placed into a simple wooden coffin before being buried in a plain grave. Contemporary accounts state that quicklime was then added to the grave, a common practice at the time that was believed to help reduce odours and speed up decomposition. Contrary to popular belief, quicklime did not completely destroy the remains. When the grave was reopened more than 20 years later, substantial skeletal remains and parts of the burial still survived. Marie Antoinette suffered a similar fate only a few months later, and following months of imprisonment, she was tried before the Revolutionary Tribunal and convicted of treason. And on the 16th of October 1793, she was then executed by guillotine. Unlike the elaborate ceremonies that had marked her arrival in France as a young Austrian archduchess, her final journey was deliberately humiliating. Dressed in a plain white dress with her hair cut short for the execution, she was transported through the streets of Paris in an open cart before being guillotined. Her body was also taken to the Madeleine cemetery and buried in a simple grave not far from that of her husband. Like Louis XVI, she received no royal memorial or permanent marker. The revolutionary authorities wanted to prevent supporters of the monarchy from turning either grave into a place of pilgrimage. For many years, the exact locations of both graves might have been lost forever had it not been for one remarkable individual. A royalist named Pierre-Louis Delaclos lived near the cemetery and quietly observed the burials. Understanding their historical importance, he carefully noted the precise locations of both graves. He later purchased the land containing them, ensuring that it would not be disturbed by further development. Delaclos even planted trees and shrubs to help preserve the sites and kept detailed records describing exactly where the king and queen had been buried. His quiet actions would later prove invaluable. Everything changed after the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1814. Following the years of war across Europe, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and the Bourbon monarchy was restored to the French throne. The new king was Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI. One of his first priorities was to honour the memory of his executed brother and sister-in-law. From his point of view, Louis XVI had died as a martyr rather than a criminal, and he believed it was essential that both he and Marie Antoinette should receive burials worthy of French royalty. Recovering their remains, therefore, became an important political and symbolic task. The restored monarchy hoped to demonstrate that the humiliation inflicted during the Revolution could, at least in part, be reversed. Excavations began at the former Madeleine cemetery in the January of 1815. Although more than 20 years had passed, Delaclos' records allowed workers to identify the likely locations of both graves. The excavation required considerable care because many other people had also been buried in the cemetery since 1793. The workers could not simply assume that every set of remains belonged to the king or queen, and instead they compared the location of each burial with Deslaclos' detailed notes whilst examining surviving coffin fragments and clothing. When Louis XVI's grave was opened, investigators found skeletal remains together with remnants of coffin and fragments of clothing that matched descriptions from 1793. These discoveries strongly supported the conclusion that the remains belonged to the former king. Marie Antoinette's grave was examined in the same careful manner. Again, investigators found skeletal remains together with surviving pieces of clothing and coffin material consistent with historical records, and her grave was exactly where Deslaclos had recorded it more than 2 decades earlier. Modern historians acknowledge that absolute scientific certainty was impossible in 1815 because DNA analysis did not exist. However, the combination of contemporary burial records, the eyewitness observations of Deslaclos, the precise grave locations and the surviving burial materials has convinced most historians that the remains were correctly identified. Once recovered, the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were treated with great respect. They were placed into new coffins prepared specifically for their final burial. On the 21st of January 1815, exactly 22 years after Louis XVI's execution, an elaborate funeral procession carried both coffins through Paris. This was intended as a powerful act of national remembrance and reconciliation. The ceremonies were attended by members of the restored royal family, government officials, clergy, soldiers, and many supporters of the Bourbon monarchy. Their destination was the Basilia of St. Denis, the traditional burial place of the kings and queens of France for over 1,000 years. Nearly every French monarch from the Middle Ages onwards had been buried there, making it the natural resting place for Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Inside the Basilia, both were buried with full royal honours. Their new tombs symbolised the restoration of their dignity after the violence and the upheaval of the Revolution. The exhumation also had an important political purpose. Louis XVIII wished to strengthen his own legitimacy as king by presenting the Bourbon dynasty as the rightful rulers of France. Giving his brother and sister-in-law royal funeral demonstrated continuity with the old monarchy, whilst reminding people of the suffering the royal family had endured. Not everyone in France agreed with the message, and many former revolutionaries continued to believe that Louis XVI had been lawfully executed. Nevertheless, for royalists, the reburial represented an act of justice and respect that had been denied for more than 20 years. Today, visitors to the Basilia of St. Denis can still see the tombs of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They remain along the Basilia's most visited monuments, standing alongside the graves of many earlier French kings and queens. Since their reburial in 1815, neither tomb has been reopened. Unlike the remains of figures such as Richard III or the Romanov family, there's been no modern archaeological excavation or forensic examination. Historians generally accept the identifications made during the Bourbon Restoration because they were based on strong documentary evidence and careful excavation rather than guesswork. The opening of the graves of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette was therefore not an attempt to solve a historical mystery. Instead, it was an effort to restore honour to a king and queen whose deaths had become symbols of one of the most dramatic revolutions in European history. More than 20 years after they were buried anonymously in a Paris cemetery, their remains were finally given the royal funeral that had been impossible during the Revolution. Their story demonstrates how political change can even affect the treatment of the dead. During the Revolution, they were buried as disgraced enemies of the state. After the restoration of the monarchy, they were then reburied as a king and a queen, deserving of honour and remembrance. More than 2 centuries later, their tombs at the Basilia of St. Denis continue to remind visitors of the extraordinary rise and fall of the French monarchy and the lasting impact of the French Revolution. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.